Battle Realms is a 2001 real-time strategy game by Liquid Entertainment. You might not be familiar with that studio, which is a shame because they actually had 2 of their games nominated for Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences awards. One of them was Desperate Housewives, the game.
I beg your pardon?
It ultimately lost to Viva Pinata in the Outstanding Achievement in Character Performance Female category, all the way back in 2007.
Right.
The other game that was nominated was Battle Realms, which, along with Black and White, Kohan, Immortal Sovereigns, and Civilization 3 had a face-off for the best PC strategy game of 2002. Civ 3 ultimately won, but Battle Realms made waves. It got a lot of praise back in the day, being well received by critics and even being chosen from Computer Gaming World's top 10 games of E3 2001. An expansion pack was released the following year, which included new maps, new units for all factions, and a completely new campaign. Despite all of this though, the game sold poorly, which is no doubt a contributing factor as to why this game remains generally unheard of. You can still get it on GOG, but this is the original version and it has some issues on modern hardware, like not being able to launch if you use multiple monitors. And also, while the original multiplayer may be dead, you can still find the occasional match on Game Ranger. Still, the game garnered a somewhat sizable cult following. Rumors persisted of a revival for years, even going so far as talking about a sequel Kickstarter. That was until an early access remaster of sorts popped up on Steam in 2019. This version, called the Zen Edition, has its code rewritten to work on modern hardware. It has widescreen support and working multiplayer. Well, mostly working. It still has a lot of the same issues that the original version has and introduces a few new ones, but the devs have laid out a roadmap that promises to add major bug fixes, new multiplayer netcode, new textures, unit balancing, and a whole bunch of other stuff. If you're gonna play any version of this game, I highly recommend the Zen Edition, despite it being labeled as an early access title. It has all the content of the original game with better functionality, and it costs the same as the original version. You won't have any of those GOG bonuses like the manual and artwork, but at least the game won't cause you too many headaches. And play it you should because Battle Realms is excellent. Battle Realms is one of the best presented RTSs that I've ever played, and it isn't that obvious just by looking at raw gameplay or screenshots of it. It's something that you really need to play in order to notice and appreciate. Let me explain. At first glance, you'll likely see that graphically the game shows its age. It is definitely a product from the early 2000s where 3D modeling was still somewhat rough, especially when it came to highly detailed figures. At a distance, units look fine, if a bit blocky. Upon closer inspection, however, you can see just how odd those unit skins wrap around their figures and how distorted faces look. The game's art style helps mitigate this a little bit, but it can only do so much. The problem is that the game relies so heavily on individual distinct pieces that don't really look good when isolated. Still, you're rarely going to be looking at them so closely that this ever really becomes an issue, and when looked at with the backdrop of the game's vibrantly colored maps, they blend in seamlessly. Those game maps are big, lush, and highly detailed. They breathe life into the game and shift the focus away from those isolated graphics, forcing you to take in the display as a whole. Surfaces have crags and patches of grass that naturally blend into one another. Bodies of water ripple and flow, and height distinctions are immediately noticeable at a glance. The expansion pack even added winter-themed maps that make the most of their snowy environments to look just as good as their springtime counterparts. And the game has some of the best fog of war that I've seen in a strategy game. As in, it actually looks like obscuring mist that units fade out of rather than just a darker overlay on top of the map. You know, notwithstanding the handful of campaign maps where you're underground, but that's a separate thing entirely. In short, the total package displayed here is great, despite some of the rougher individual edges. The game even ships with a fairly powerful and intuitive map editing tool that highlights just how well these elements blend together in-game, to the point of even being able to configure the amount of clouds, the wind speed, and the water translucency if you wanted to. Just be warned that regardless of which version of the game you're playing, if you're using this on a PC with multiple monitors, this program will not launch at all. You're gonna have to disable that other monitor in order to create the world that you're envisioning in your pretty little head. And this isn't even the least of the game's graphical issues either. On top of the faulty exe file not launching on certain computers, the game wasn't designed to naturally scale with high-resolution widescreen setups either. So you'll occasionally get some weird instances while playing through the campaigns, like maps taking a brief moment to load when launching a mission, or cutscenes showing objects or units on screen that you're not supposed to see.
Of course it does. We owe you much. Gone so soon?
I am always here.
Of course it does. We owe you much. Gone so soon?
I am always here.
Sometimes if your camera is zoomed in while triggering a cutscene, it won't pull back out.
The shale is broken. Where's our rice? Greedy, greedy. I'll send for it soon. Who's there?
I bear a message from the great Mistress Yvain.
This completely messes up the framing of the cinematic, sort of like watching an episode of Seinfeld on Netflix.
No!
And on top of all of this, one of the most common errors in the game is a bug where the minimap appears completely blacked out, with the exception of your own units and the resources on the map, as well as an accompanying glitch that doesn't shape your unit shadows correctly. You're gonna see these black blobs around each of your units, and it's really distracting to see. Alt-tabbing out of the program and going back in usually fixes the issue, unless you happen to be playing on a map that's underground. In this case, your minimap will display correctly, but your shadows will still be flat omnidirectional squares. This is probably the most annoying graphical error out of the bunch just because of how distracting it is. And honestly, I think it has something to do with the map's lighting, as in, because you're underground and there's no source of light, the game doesn't exactly know how to calculate these shadows. Nevertheless, this is an issue that is supposed to be addressed in an upcoming patch that does add proper widescreen resolutions, improves textures, and upgrades the codebase from DX7 to DX9 and 12. This patch is currently being tested for quality assurance after a few delays at the time of writing the script, so all the footage you've seen so far doesn't incorporate any of these fixes. Still, even without these fixes, even with these errors, one of the major elements that makes Battle Realms truly shine is its absolute laser focus on the small details that make the world you play in feel truly responsive and alive. The graphics may have aged poorly, but it's all the extra details around them that adds a layer of vibrancy to the game that really props its presentation up more than just a few pegs. Small details like wolves, frogs, and lizards skittering around the map and footprints being left behind in snow and dirt are superficial, but birds fluttering from their forest canopies actually serves as an important function as they respond to movement. Sprinting through the woods startles them, and so they flutter and scurry. This is accompanied by not only an audio cue, but a marker on the minimap that shows directly where the movement takes place. These birds respond not only to army movements, both player and AI, but even to wild horses that get spooked and run through the woods. It's a really neat system that naturally integrates map awareness as a tactical consideration. But map interaction doesn't end there. Some maps have these comically large boulders that are interactable, and if you touch them, you can actually roll them down whatever hill they happen to be on. This lets you live out your inner Indiana Jones fantasy with your enemy on the receiving end. Well, ideally.
Done.
Even the water is more than just a collectible resource. Peasants can be instructed to water rice fields to stimulate their growth, which is useful when the crop is in short supply. What's neat is that the game also has random weather patterns, and when it rains, harvests become more bountiful and your fields regrow automatically. The same principle is applied to burning buildings, which themselves even have a variable ignition rate depending on how strong the source of the damage is. One raider throwing torches at a building won't do much, but 2 or 3 can cause a watchtower to incinerate in no time at all. And of course, this is harder to pull off when it's raining for obvious reasons. Blood will seep into flowing water naturally. Units will explode depending on the type of weapon that kills them. This is most common with explosives like muskets or cannons, but the Reaper's Scythe does the same thing, to a very satisfying end. Even weapon gore is intelligently applied, as enemy blood will only stain the areas of the weapons that are actually used in combat, like this Sledger's hammer over here, which is pristine on one side, but stained with the blood of his enemies on the one that was actually used to smash in their skulls.
Look at my muscles!
And speaking of units, they haven't been ignored either, as they have a number of different situational animations. Selecting them and highlighting them will cause them to immediately jump into a battle stance, and each one has their own unique idle animations too. It's not uncommon to see sumo wrestling powder keg cannoneers throw salt onto the ground, or a samurai bow down and pray. Some of these actually double as quote-unquote hidden abilities. The Blade Acolyte, for instance, will sharpen his swords if left alone long enough, leaving them glimmering afterwards. This actually increases the amount of damage he'll do with his next attack. These are all relatively minor details in and of themselves, but the quality of these details are staggering. When they come together, they create this beautiful tapestry that really gives this game a level of handcrafted quality that just deepens my appreciation for the effort put into this game's presentation. Some of these things are purely aesthetic, but the others are elements of gameplay that make logical sense and demonstrate that environmental interactions don't necessarily always have to be player driven. I actually don't think I've seen this level of background depth in any other RTS before, at least none off the top of my head. All of this is what really pushes Battle Realms beyond just the surface level graphical fidelity, and why I consider the entire presentation to be top notch. None of that is even going into the game's audio assets and soundtrack either. Background details in the game may be great touches and do much to help the game age gracefully, but the game's audio is outstanding. The ambient sounds and sound effects work in tandem with those background details to add that layer of believability to the world, and that doesn't disappoint here at all. I've already talked about things like the fluttering of birds and their chirping as you pass through forests, but even things like the sounds of rushing water naturally swelling as you approach it, or the splashing sounds of soldiers wading through it exist in the world to build on that sense of immersion. Each of the game's units have unique voice lines and quirks for general movement or attack actions, or even death sounds, and the sounds of combat are rich, weighty, and punchy. The clanging of steel on armor is obviously the most common, but you'll hear things like the blunt impacts of hammers, the energetic shrills of magic, and explosive bangs. Cannonballs thunderously crash into buildings, fire crackles and spreads in intensity, and wood splinters and shatters as buildings are destroyed. Even calling up the menus have different sound effects that correspond with each faction's particular art style. And the game's soundtrack is just so good. The tracks are more or less what you expect given the game's theming, and the combination of strings and flutes do not disappoint. Composer Matt Hull does a fantastic job of creating a suite of music that helps draw out the wuxia influence of the setting, but is also well composed and catchy. And on that note, I should probably mention that each and every song has a combat variant that seamlessly mixes in anytime the game detects that battle has begun. These variants are faster, more intense, and grander in terms of how the soundscapes are filled, with a blend of different instruments to punctuate action sequences. And it's totally distinct, too. Each faction has its own theme songs that sound wholly unique and representative of the respective cultures and stylings. Lotus Clan songs are dark and reminiscent of corruption and plague, which makes sense given that they're all about profane magic and sacrificing their physical bodies to unlock inner power. The Serpent Clan are all about traditional Japanese flutes and strings played at a higher tempo, whereas their peaceful and more introspective dragon cousins use the same elements for something slower and that feels more introspective. There's an obvious dichotomy between the casting of the treacherous serpent and noble dragon, a distinction between their outlooks of inner cultivation versus survival at any cost. And finally, there's the Wolf Clan, who have tracks that are these booming tribal marches that make heavy use of percussion to carry their melodies. There are a few standout tracks that fall more in line with the Serpent and Dragon tracks, but for the most part, Wolf songs are a lot less grand in nature. But that being said, their combat variants are splendid, and by incorporating more strings, they sound like anthems of valor and heroism. By now, I'm sure a lot of you are probably going to notice that Battle Realms has a striking familiarity to Warcraft 3 in terms of looks, presentation, and to an extent gameplay. You might even be tempted to call it a clone, but Battle Realms actually came out 8 months prior. Besides, Battle Realms does plenty to differentiate itself from the pack. If anything, Battle Realms is like Warcraft 3 if Warcraft 3 had a torrid love affair with a geisha girl and outpopped an alternate reality Akira Kurosawa, who ran D&D games in his basement. It's a high fantasy blend of wuxia and Japanese mythology that presents a world broken up into 4 highly distinct, highly characterized clans with wizards and magic orbs, where sumo wrestlers hit the treadmill to become samurai, and where you can tame horses by punching them in the jaw. Make no mistake about it, this is some exotic high fantasy at its best. The world of Battle Realms takes place on an island continent that was essentially created due to a cataclysm. The manual goes into some detail about the fall of the ancient dragon clan at the hands of the mysterious demonic horde, how the world was shattered to save them from total destruction, and how they shed their lofty ideals and transformed into the Serpent Clan. This part of the backstory is reiterated a little bit during the opening cutscene of the main campaign, so even without reading the manual, you're given enough context to know the stakes. But I still highly recommend that you go through the manual anyway, if for no other reason than it being an 80-page in-universe breakdown of every single unit, faction, hero, and concept in the game, all framed as if the information being presented is shared with you like you're sharing a few drinks with a wise old master who's lived in this world his whole life. It's just such a fun thing to dive into. And oh man, does it make me feel nostalgic for the era when game manuals were highly detailed world-building affairs. God, I miss those years so much. But all the world building in the universe can't save you if you don't have the gameplay to back it up. And the gameplay is where you really start to deviate from your standard RTS fare. As a strategy game, Battle Realms is wholly unparalleled by anything else I've played. Most strategy games function more or less the same way, with allocation of resources, the creation of builder units that are used to expand your base of operations, and the training of military units to engage and overthrow your enemies. Throw in some variations in faction tech trees and the occasional hero unit, and you have your bog standard real-time strategy game. Battle Realms' approach to the first 2 facets isn't really unchanged. Peasants still gather resources, in this case rice and water, which are then spent on erecting a relatively small number of buildings. However, where Battle Realms starts to deviate is with its unit creation. Rather than creating new units outright, these same peasants that are responsible for your infrastructure are trained into the soldiers that you use for your army. At the modest cost of some rice and water, any peasant sent to one of your 3 basic military buildings exits a tougher man, or woman, ready to serve and die for your clan. These units can be further upgraded by training them in your other basic military buildings. A dragon spearman, for instance, becomes a dragon warrior if he trains at the archery dojo, or a kabuki warrior if he trains at a chemist's hut. Taking that unit and training it in the opposite building then nets you a samurai. These tier 3 units are powerful, but they need to be balanced with other lower tier units too. One reason for this is because the entire training process for them is very expensive. You're not only paying 3 different training costs to upgrade a peasant up to that higher rank unit, but the cost to upgrade to that 3rd tier is also significantly more expensive than the previous 2. So while it's possible to field an army that's made up exclusively of gallant samurai, it might not be the most economically viable. The other issue is that although these tier 3 units may be individually powerful, your units can be upgraded in a number of different ways, including learning special abilities that you want to employ in certain situations and against certain strategies, but I'll talk about this a little bit more later. Each faction also has a 4th tier of units, which you acquire by sacrificing your tier 3 units in some manner or another. Putting 2 Lotus Warlocks against one another in the Warlocks Tower creates a Master Warlock. The manual states that the 2 Warlocks engage in a duel, and the victor wears the polished skull of the loser as a sign of his mastery of the forbidden path.
That's fucking metal as fuck, dude!
Wolf Clan Berserkers receive a blessing from a Druidess, and then permanently transform into furry death machines. If you bless them again, then they learn a bite attack that does critical damage, and, if it kills an enemy, turns them into a wolf that fights alongside you. The Serpent Clan sends 4 of its Ronin to sacrifice themselves at the Necromancer's throne, a structure that, and I quote, beneath which are entombed the skulls of the innocent. Man, fucking Serpent and Lotus clans should get together and start a black metal band or something. The Necromancer that comes forth from this throne can then summon loyal spirit warriors, and raise the corpses of fallen enemies as zombies, who fight until their flesh decays and they fall apart. Finally, the Dragon Clan is a little bit different in that they don't receive a unit for sacrificing 4 samurai. Instead, they basically summon the spirit of a dragon that gives them a very large AoE attack. It's not nearly as exciting as the other 3 clans. However, this entire system of army creation through training upgrades is further complicated by the fact that Battle Realms doesn't actually allow you to manually create peasants. Instead, peasants are automatically generated at a timed interval that slows down as your overall population increases. This creates a rubber band effect that makes it harder to maintain a large army when you're near the unit cap, but it also means that it's quicker to muster units when your population is low, which gives you a bit of a chance to stage a comeback if you ever find yourself in a position where you've been demolished but you're still hanging on to dear life. Of course, that's meaningless if you're so overwhelmed you can't fend off the enemy enough to give you some breathing room, but so long as you're not totally crushed by an all-out offensive, there's always that chance to rebuild from the ruins and stage a counterattack. Because of this system, Battle Realms has a low unit total, capping out at 30 for normal gameplay, although a few specific missions will increase the limit to 40 or 50 for balancing purposes. Now, you might be thinking that the low population numbers makes it difficult to eliminate any vestiges of resistance and end games. This is partially true. But the game does include a mechanic that reveals any enemy units to players if there's no combat buildings left standing. It even shows you a timer for how long you have until this happens if you're on the receiving end. However, this only happens for a brief moment, and even then, some missions still turn into slogs that require you to hunt down a single unit or building to complete them. And on top of that, this doesn't trigger if there are still military buildings left standing, which means that lone watchtower with a single unit sitting up there holding the line as every other remnant of his home and family are wiped clean and used to feed the worms in the ground? Yeah, you're gonna have to spread out and find him before you can even think about progressing. Luckily, you have the ability to sprint across the map. Double-clicking on the map with a unit or a group of units selected causes them to break like the wind. All units in the game have a blue stamina meter just below their health bars, which is used for things like sprinting and using special abilities. Your stamina will naturally fill up over time, so long as you're standing still. Walking won't drain it, but it won't fill it up either. You're gonna need to stop and catch your breath to be at your best. This adds a little bit more tactical depth to the game than some other RTSs. Do you need to get to an area on the map quickly and hold it, or can you be patient and arrive to battle fresh? And there are other considerations too. As previously mentioned, sprinting through woods spooks the birds and causes them to flutter about. This pings the minimap with a special icon, letting you know that there's some unseen movement in that general area, which can then take away any stealth advantage that the army may have initially had. It's up to you to determine if swiftness, visibility, or the ability to cast all of your special abilities is the most pertinent thing to have in these situations. Much like stamina, units in Battle Realms will also heal naturally if standing idly by. Units can only heal so much, however, and they'll never be able to completely fill up their health bars naturally. The only exception to this is the Wolf Clan. However, they're also the only clan that doesn't have any healing units who can patch them up quickly in battle, whereas the other 3 do. The emphasis on special, individualized units in the peasant economy creates a unique dynamic for Battle Realms that I haven't quite seen in other strategy games before or since. In most games, there's a stark contrast between the economic side of things and the military side of things, without so much crossover in between. Resource gatherers collect resources and build buildings, and that's about it. Battle Realms has you juggling the allocation of manpower between these two constantly as you try to strike a balance between building up your fortifications and fielding an army that can properly fight. This balancing act can make it difficult for new players to understand how the game itself is balanced, and as a result, Battle Realms is a little bit harder than some of the other RTSs I've played. And the AI isn't a pushover either. There are numerous different presets in skirmish mode, all of which vary in terms of their aggressiveness and tactics. They can be pretty tricky sometimes too, even trying to bait you into ambushes, which I don't think I've seen in other RTSs before either. However, I think this is only possible due to how aggressive units are when they see enemies, though I'll talk about the game's flaws a little bit later. But once you understand the ebb and flow of having a stable economy and maintaining a sizable army, you can understand how different units can complement one another in battle, and you'll see that the system is actually very elegant and it works really well. There are other various strategies that can be employed, which gets even further complicated with other tactical considerations. Horses, for instance, are a finite resource that spawn on most game maps. Unlike other RTSs where you build a stable and train cavalry, in Battle Realms, you build a stable to house your horses, which are then collected by using a peasant to tame and retrieve them. Once they're at your stable, you can either send a military unit to take one of them and mount it, or if you're the Wolf Clan, train a peasant into a packmaster who then has 3 wolves follow him around. Alternatively, the 3 clans who don't feed their horses to wolves can send a peasant over to collect a pack horse, which increases the carrying capacity of the peasant who's currently leading it. More carrying capacity means faster resource collection. And another cool thing about horses is that you or your opponent can sometimes be forcibly dismounted during battle. If you then kill that unit, you can steal the horse afterwards. On top of all that, each unit in Battle Realms has their own suite of special abilities, which are broken up into techniques and battle gear. Techniques are straightforward. These are universal upgrades that affect every single unit in your army. Things like increased damage, increased health, increased stamina, longer range, resistance to certain damage types, or an increased natural healing rate. You buy them by spending either yin or yang, which depends on which clan you're playing as. Serpent and Lotus gather yin, Dragon and Wolf gather yang. This is accumulated through fighting. The more enemies you kill, the more of either resource you get. You can also spend a couple of yin-yang points, in conjunction with a hefty levy of rice and water, to purchase Zen Masters. These hero units are powerful and have their own special abilities that, as you may guess, can turn the tide of battle if your back is against the wall. The other special abilities are battle gear, and these are unique to every individual unit in the game. Most units can learn 1 or 2 different kinds, and these are generally active rather than passive. The way that you learn these varies by clan. The Dragon and Serpent clan have 2 unique buildings that offer differing battle gear, depending on which unit is sent where. The Wolf clan has 1, but this upgrade comes in the form of special armor. They have Druidesses that can bless their units with more interesting abilities. The Lotus clan lacks these buildings entirely. Instead, they can either use one of 3 special units that you build at the Crypt of the Brothers to bless their clansmen, much like the Wolf Clan, or you can send a tier 2 unit to cannibalize one of your peasants.
My trees!
These abilities offer a lot of variety in terms of tactical options. Anything from flaming firing arrows, spinning your weapon in a 360-degree circle, turning invisible, or even paralyzing your opponent fall under the category of battle gear. You can plant mines or even prevent watchtowers from damaging your surrounding army. They offer a plethora of tactical options depending on loadout and army makeup, and the variety of abilities creates for some very interesting encounters. It's a much needed addition to the game in order to not only increase the amount of tactical depth it has, but to differentiate it from other RTSs and give it a little bit of extra something to offer gameplay variety. Furthermore, many units have special innate abilities that aren't trained or even explicitly stated in the manual. These abilities are ever present, regardless of what upgrades or battle gear the units have acquired. They're always there, and a lot of them you just discover through playing the game. I already mentioned the Blade Acolytes before, but there are others. If you have a bandit, for instance, he can loot enemy corpses for some extra rice and water. And unclean ones will dissolve into a pool of black ooze when they die, significantly lowering the FOV of any unit standing in it for a short while. I touched upon this a little bit while talking about the game's soundtrack, but Battle Realms has 4 main playable factions, and each of them are radically different. There's the ancient and virtuous Dragon Clan, the devious and tenacious Serpent Clan, the ferocious and noble Wolf Clan, and the dark and twisted Lotus Clan. Obviously they all have different cosmetics, but there's also some significant gameplay differences that reflect their various cultures within the universe too. And I feel that's especially important to point out simply because a key feature of RTSs are different playable factions, and having such wildly different factions that bear only a basic functional commonality creates a lot more variety when it comes to gameplay. What I really like about Battle Realms is that the game goes out of its way to try and tie in each of these differences into their respective clans' cultures and way of life, and it uses its lore to justify any gameplay variations. The Dragon Clan is more or less the archetype of a noble samurai faction. They're all about the Bushido Code, resembling a shogunate where honor, discipline, and fairness rule. And their most noble aspiration is the cultivation of inner balance and perfection, whether it's through the martial ability of their warriors or the lowly peasant tending the fields. Their units and buildings resemble this, using a few different dojos and a royal academy to train their units, where you have to perfect your abilities rather than just get thrown a weapon and go on your way, and fireworks factories and shrines that unlock battle gear. The Serpent Clan are their mirror opposites. They ostensibly resemble the noble Dragon Clan, but, as their name implies, they've fallen from grace and are much more devious and deceptive. Forced to survive in a harsh world after the land was shattered and the dragon destroyed, they could no longer rely on their ideals, but rather do whatever is necessary to survive, essentially shedding their honor to become merchants and thieves. This is represented in their tech tree. Dojos are replaced with taverns, their alchemists with musketeers, and rather than cultivating their abilities effectively to use bows, they train with the much easier to use crossbow. They can also temper their weapons with poison and are generally unscrupulous as a rule. The Lotus are a strange clan. Their shtick is corruption, in that their forebears all underwent some horrible spiritual and physical transformations in order to gain access to some pretty dark and twisted magic. That corruption is the source of their power, and you can see that in Lotus architecture and even their voice lines. They're basically what you get if you take the cults of Slaanesh and Nurgle and smash them together. You can see this especially in their mid-tier units, the diseased, infested, and unclean ones, and even in how these units obtain their battle gear, as I mentioned before, either through the consumption of their peasants, or through the dark blessings by a trio of revered liches that serve the clan. And their healers, instead of using stamina to just weave healing magic, snap the necks of ravens to channel their dark powers. It's freaky stuff, but I would expect nothing less from a clan that trains wartime dominatrixes for battle. Finally, the Wolf Clan is about as salt of the earth as you can get, and by that I mean that they're backwards barbarian hicks.
Ready to swing? They're after our buildings!
They have the deepest connection to the land between all four of the other clans, and they resemble the noble savage stereotype. Their buildings are all simple stone shelters, lacking the intricate architecture of the other clans. They can train wolves, and through their nature magic, they can turn into fast-moving and hard-hitting werewolves. They were also slaves for a very long time, forced to mine precious shale. As a result, their units all resemble a ragtag group of rebels that use whatever they can get their hands on to fight. Giant mallets, carved shale knuckles, and even slings and giant rocks are all the weapons of choice for the Wolf Clan. You'll become acquainted with all of these clans over the course of the game's 2 campaigns, which will introduce you to a wide cast of characters and show you the delicate political balance of power that they find themselves in the center of. As you might expect from a hero-focused RTS with deep lore, the game's campaigns are largely character-driven and center around a handful of larger-than-life figures. I'm going to be going into details for the game's plot in this section, so if you don't want spoilers, skip to here. Okay. Battle Realms has 2 playable campaigns. The first is Kenji's journey. It puts you in the shoes of Kenji Oja, the heir to the Serpent Empire who returns after an 8-year exile to unify the land. In the very first mission, you're given a choice to either help some bandits burn down a peasant village, or to defend that village from them. Your choice here will determine whether you play through the campaign as the Dragon or the Serpent Clan. The general plot remains more or less the same, regardless of which path you choose. However, they do take some pretty radical turns just based on what each clan espouses. This is reflected not only in their divergent plotlines, but also in presentation. Kenji's voice actor recorded 2 different scripts for the campaign, and even his tone and inflection changes whether or not he's the kinder and gentler rebuilder of the Dragon Clan, or the more sinister and ruthless heir to the Serpent Clan.
There must be a better way.
They fight because they fear the Serpent Clan.
I'm not my father, Atomo.
There are worse men you could be.
Not many.
Did you kill him?
Does it matter?
Not to me.
All of us fighting together. It's just like old times, eh? Our scouts report that the Lotus clan have abandoned their outpost rather than face you. The wolf squatters to the west are staying put, but a little steel and fire should put an end to...
No.
But we have them by the throat!
If we push on, we can reach the Swan's Pool by dusk.
We should have killed them all when we had the chance. My brother was right. Where have you been?
Putting out fires. This is madness, Kenji. We've driven these people from their homes.
My homes. Their fields, their livestock, their daughters, their sons. All mine. This is Serpent Land.
You sound like your father.
There are worse men to be. Get the troops moving. If we push on, we can reach the Swan's Pool by dusk.
The key moment where the plot splits is after the first battle of Serpentholm. In the dragon storyline, Kenji presses forward to meet with the old dragon spirit for wisdom and guidance. While he's away, his general, Shinja, disgusted with Kenji's apparent weakness, murders his other general, Otomo, and stages a coup. This culminates into Kenji accepting the Serpent's Orb is utterly meaningless, and it's faith what gives it power. The Horde then gives the orb to the Lotus clan, who seek to use its dormant magic to extend their dominion over the entirety of the land, and it's up to Kenji to put an end to the sorcerers once and for all. Eventually, the shadowy entity that gave the orb to the Lotus, and is later revealed to have been the real murderer of Kenji's father, thus forcing him into exile in the first place, reveals itself to be the Nightvolt, a mysterious demon-like entity that commands the very horde that forced Terrant the Elder to gather his clan and flee their homeland. The Serpent Path naturally sees a more violent, aggressive, and ruthless Kenji. Here, it's Shinja who's sent to parley with the Dragon Spirit, while Kenji decides to pursue his enemies to the north. Shinja finds a necromancer who has devastated the mountain where the Dragon Spirit would otherwise be found, and he's very eager to help Kenji. Also, he can harness the power of the corpses that the Lord Serpent leaves in his wake. Upon their return, they learn that Otomo has allied himself with the Wolf Clan in rebellion against Kenji, but they're ultimately crushed. Here, Kenji is obsessed with the Dragon's Orb. The Nightvolt eventually gives it to the Wolf Clan, who then try to use it to return to their original homeland, but Kenji stops at nothing to reclaim it. After interrupting their ritual and all but destroying the clan, the Nightvolt appears and is defeated, and the rebuilt Serpent Empire turn their blades on the remnants of the Horde, ready to cut them down and stand as the supreme power of the land. The second campaign, Greyback's Journey, was added by the game's expansion, The Winter of the Wolf. It takes a bit of a different approach than Kenji's journey, as, despite it being just as character-driven, it focuses a lot more on the titular character and a little bit less on the Empire expansion part. This campaign is also completely linear. The events of Greyback's Journey take place before Kenji's return to his homeland, making this a prequel. The actual timeline for all this is muddled since the manual states that the Wolf Rebellion came after decades of servitude, not a mere 7 years. And then again, the manual also mentions that the first contact with the Wolf Clan was made 6 months after the world was broken and a fleet of ships broke onto the northern shore of the continent. None of this is shown in the intro cinematic. Either way, the first few missions act the same way as Kenji's do. They're there to acclimate you to the game, all while narrating the beginnings of the Wolf Clan's rebellion against their Lotus Masters and Serpent Overlords, as you're attempting to break free of your enslavement to them. Greyback's Journey is ultimately a revenge story. After being sent to the deep part of the mines to essentially die, Greyback discovers that his clan's prized Wolf Skull totem had been hidden there, for some reason, by Yvain, the Lotus sorceress in charge of shale mining. Greyback organizes a rebellion and escapes from the mines, and soon discovers Yvain's plan to use the totem's magic to cover the land in a perpetual winter, for some reason. He rebuilds his clan, crushes a few armies on the way, and marches into Yvain's fortress, where he finds that she has corrupted the totem and drawn from its power to strengthen her own. Greyback defeats her in single combat, the totem is destroyed, and Greyback returns to continue leading his people in their struggle for freedom. Unlike Kenji's journey, this campaign is a little bit more experimental. There are a number of levels in which you control either a single unit or a small number of units, and you're forced to build your forces as you wander around a map. But there are also a number of levels that have a lot of special objectives that you don't see in Kenji's campaign. Some of these include things like having to find hidden switches and hit them to open up your path to continue, or light a signal fire to call in for reinforcements. This section right here is cool. You need to roll boulders onto a village to stop it from turning invisible. It makes way more sense in context, I swear. And the final battle against Yvain requires you to destroy these orbs around the wolf totem in order to make her vulnerable to your attacks. Kenji's campaign is great. There's a ton of replayability in it due to the branching paths, not only in terms of the respective storylines, whether or not you're playing as the Dragon or Serpent clans, but in the mission choices within that framework. I absolutely love the fact that the game includes crossroads that make you choose between one choice of a mission or another. And this extends to the recruitable heroes that you get during the campaign too, although not all of them are going to be available on a single playthrough. Some are exclusive to certain missions, but once you do have these heroes, you can then recruit them at will during the second and third acts when you're able to build a keep. The campaign itself has an interesting story that is paced very well, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. Plus, the missions themselves feel balanced and fair, offering just the right amount of challenge necessary not to bore you, and offering enough scenario variety to keep things interesting and fresh. Greyback's campaign starts off much slower with a lot of mazes that just aren't as interesting to play. It still limits your access to all of the clan's advanced buildings and units until the later chapters, however this curve is much shorter than Kenji's journey, which makes sense given that this was a campaign designed for people who have, presumably, already finished the base game's campaign. Still, the unit balance feels all over the place with this one. Some missions have starting armies that feel inadequate to get you started, and its penchant for one-on-one or one-on-several duels is irritating, since gameplay feels like it devolves into something like a MOBA. However, it does have a little bit more going for it in terms of mission variety, even if it sacrifices those branching paths I love so much in Kenji's journey. Still, the change to a linear structure doesn't lend itself to a story that feels as tightly written as Kenji's was, and Greyback's journey also certainly feels shorter. Despite thinking that Kenji's journey is the clear winner of the two, I don't think that Greyback's is bad, it just doesn't live up to how well Kenji's journey was executed. But for all the majesty that I've spun for you about Battle Realms, there are several things that tarnish this otherwise sterling presentation. If you're not a fan of micromanagement heavy RTSs, Battle Realms is probably not for you. The game UI doesn't scale particularly well when you're commanding an army equipped to the brim with battle gear, and navigating what's happening during a battle is a monumental task. If you have your whole army selected, you'll need to scroll over to the next page or two of your other units in order to see everything that they have equipped. The good news is that, at the very least, the game tries to group your units that have battle gear onto the first page. But things are so chaotic during battle that you're constantly watching a handful of individual duels trying to find out the one key moment when to use your special abilities. And more often than not, your units will just die before you get to use their equipment, which could entirely jettison your carefully constructed plans. This is made especially more difficult given to how aggressive units are. They'll chase down enemies constantly, breaking formation and charging into groups of enemies all by themselves that causes them to melt quickly. In fact, I think it's only because of this behavior that makes those aforementioned ambushes possible. Combine that with some very irritating pathing issues that draw your units towards the nearest enemy regardless of whether or not you want to attack it, and it makes for some very, very frustrating gameplay. Trying to withdraw from combat is especially bad in this regard. Even with the command to retreat, your units will ignore your orders and rush back in to attack the enemy constantly. So long as they catch even the smallest of glimpses of the filthy enemy colors, they'll make sure to try to dye them red. This happens all the time. It's very frustrating. Now, you might be saying, but CyberSkull, why don't you just set them to guard or passive mode like any other RTS, you idiot? Well, that's because there's no option to turn it on for a group of units all at once. The mode has to be turned on for each unit individually, making it a tedious affair, and on top of that, the unit stance is automatically turned off if you issue them a move order after assigning it. Now, that might not sound so bad when you consider the low population, but it's still very tedious and annoying to set for every single individual soldier, especially when you consider that every single move order is an attack move. I suppose that you can use hotkeys, but I'm gonna be honest with you, I never remember to use them. I admit that's my own fault, but I also know that there are others out there who rely on clicking everything when they play RTSs like I do. So to my fellow brothers in lethargy, you've been warned. You're welcome. Another thing that I really dislike when it comes to combat is the inability to select secondary attacks manually. Some units, like the Dragon Samurai or Serpent Bandit, have both a melee and a ranged attack, but you can't actually select which one of those two attacks you want to use, and I'm not exactly sure what contexts call for them to be used either. Sometimes I want to engage the enemy at a distance and not charge in, but I can't manually trigger that to happen. It'd be really nice if the game was either more forthright about how it determines which attack you use, or it gives you a selection. And really, that tops the list of all the problems I have with the game. There's nothing utterly game-breaking or that's overly annoying to deal with that makes me not want to recommend it, just some things that get under my skin while I'm playing. And despite all those issues, I have nothing but praise for Battle Realms. I love this game, and I'm willing to bet that I'd love it just as much now, even if it wasn't a pretty significant part of my preteen gaming repertoire. It's just a shame that Liquid Entertainment never managed to recapture the magic that they did when they struck gold with Battle Realms. But with the Zen Edition in active development under the watchful eye of Liquid founder Ed Del Castillo, there just may be more of the realms to explore in the future. If you're in the mood for a truly unique RTS with some Japanese fantasy flavor, don't hesitate to check out Battle Realms. And don't let the early access moniker fool you. You'll get the complete game and the expansion pack, and you'll help fund further game fixes and, with some luck, new content down the line. For now though, I'm just glad that I can effortlessly kick back and relive the magic and mayhem that is this lovely hidden gem. If you're a fan of RTSs, check out Battle Realms. You won't be disappointed, especially if you're the kind of person that appreciates some experimentation that mixes up some tried and true gameplay genres.
Return